Have you ever woken up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, after a dream so vivid it felt like you were truly living it? The kind of dream that clings to you even after you open your eyes, leaving a trace of dread you can't shake. My name is Vaughn, an environmental scientist who studies the depths of lakes and rivers. But what I'm about to share with you isn't from any research or fieldwork. It's from a nightmare I had, one that I can't explain and that still haunts me to this day. A nightmare that began as an ordinary dream but quickly descended into something far darker, something that's made me question the line between dream and reality. I've spent years studying bodies of water, from calm rivers to murky lakes, but nothing could have prepared me for the lake in my dream. It was a place I had never seen before, yet it felt as though it had been waiting for me all along, its cold waters holding secrets far older than I could ever imagine. The more I think about it, the more I realize maybe it wasn't just a dream. Maybe that place, that lake, exists somewhere out there waiting. Before we dive into this tale, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, because the story I'm about to share isn't for the faint of heart. What lies ahead is filled with darkness, uncertainty, and the kind of fear that creeps up on you when you least expect it. As a scientist, I've always believed in logic and reason, but this experience defies explanation. It's as if the lake called to me, like it was pulling me into its depths, not just in my dream, but in my waking life, too. Every night since then, I've felt its presence, lurking just beneath the surface of my mind, waiting for me to fall asleep again. But this time, I won't be caught off guard. This time, I'm prepared to confront whatever it is that hides in the shadows of that cursed water. So if you're brave enough, follow me as we explore the dark, unsettling tale of the silent lake, where nightmares don't end when you wake up. They only begin. It all started on an ordinary night, but what I experienced was far from ordinary. What you're about to hear isn't just a story. It's a warning to stay away from the lake, a warning to keep your dreams, your nightmares, far from places like this. So, are you ready? It was one of those nights where sleep comes easily, but the dreams that follow drag you into a world you can't escape from. In my dream, I found myself standing on the edge of a lake, one I had never seen before, but its eerie stillness sent a shiver down my spine. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the silence around me was unnatural, so quiet that even the sound of my own breathing felt out of place. The lake stretched out endlessly before me, the water smooth like glass, reflecting the pale glow of the moon. There was something about the water, something wrong. Its surface was too still, too perfect, as if it were waiting for me to make the first move. As I took a step closer, the ground beneath my feet shifted. It wasn't sand or gravel. It felt soft, damp, almost as if I was walking on flesh. The sensation made my stomach churn, but I couldn't stop. The smell of wet earth and something rotting filled the air, thick and nauseating, clinging to my senses. I felt an overwhelming sense of déjà vu, like I had been here before, but I couldn't place when or how. Each step was slow, deliberate, the sound of my shoes squelching in the mud the only thing breaking the oppressive silence. It was as if the world around me was holding its breath, waiting for something dark, to emerge from the depths. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it, a low, rhythmic sound, like the distant echo of a heartbeat coming from the lake. The sound wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, each pulse sending a wave of unease through my body. I looked around, expecting to see anyone, but there was no one. I was alone, or at least, I thought I was. The shadows around the lake seemed to move, shifting as if something, or someone, was watching me from the tree-line. My heart pounded my chest, but I forced myself to keep walking, drawn closer to the water, even though every instinct screamed at me to turn back. As I reached the edge of the lake, I knelt down, compelled to touch the water. The surface was unnervingly cold, far colder than it should have been, and as my fingers brushed against it, I felt a sudden, sharp pull, like something beneath the water had grabbed hold of me. I yanked my hand back, heart racing, but there was nothing there, just the still, silent water. as if it hadn't moved at all. I stumbled back, my pulse hammering in my ears, and that's when I saw it. A face, just beneath the surface, staring up at me. Pale, hollow eyes locked onto mine, expressionless, but filled with something dark, something ancient. My breath caught in my throat, my legs frozen in place. I blinked, and the face was gone. The water was calm again, undisturbed, as if nothing had ever been there. But I knew what I had seen. It wasn't just a reflection. It was something real, something waiting just beneath the surface. The heartbeat sound grew louder, more insistent, echoing in my mind as I stumbled backward, my heart racing with fear. Whatever was in that lake, it was watching me, waiting. And somehow, I knew. This wasn't just a dream. This was something much darker, much more dangerous. As the sensation of being watched grew unbearable, I turned to run, but the ground beneath me seemed to shift, like it was pulling me back toward the water. I could feel it, something trying to drag me into the lake, into its cold, suffocating depths. Panic surged through me, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I struggled to move, but my feet were stuck, sinking into the wet, fleshy ground. And then, just as I thought I would be pulled under, I woke up, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding as if I had just escaped from something monstrous. But the fear didn't fade. The sound of that heartbeat still echoed in my ears, and the memory of that face, those empty, staring eyes, haunted me, even in the safety of my bed. I knew then that this was no ordinary dream. This was the beginning of something much more sinister, and I was already too deep to escape. The nights following the dream were far from restful. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the lake pulling me back, dragging me deeper into its cold embrace. But it wasn't just the dreams that unsettled me. There were strange things happening around me, things I couldn't explain. Objects in my house seemed to move on their own. I would leave my keys on the table, only to find them on the kitchen counter hours later. At first, I dismissed it as absent-mindedness, but then the shadows started shifting. In the corners of my vision, I would catch glimpses of movement, just out of reach, just out of sight. But when I turned to look, nothing was there. I began to feel like I wasn't alone, even in my own home. The sense of being watched grew stronger with each passing day. It followed me everywhere, at work, in my car, even when I went out for a walk. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the edge of my perception, something waiting for the right moment to show itself. The air around me felt thick, oppressive, like the weight of invisible eyes pressing down on my every move. I would wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced that someone or something was in the room with me. But every time I turned on the light, there was nothing, just the empty silence of the night. One evening, as I was lying in bed, I heard it again, that low rhythmic sound, the heartbeat from my dream. It started faintly, like a distant echo, but as I listened, it grew louder, reverberating through the walls of my bedroom. My pulse quickened, and I sat up, scanning the room for any sign of movement. The sound seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, pulsing in time with my own heartbeat. Then, in the stillness, I noticed something impossible. The shadows in the corners of the room were moving, crawling along the walls as if they were alive. I froze, paralyzed by fear, as the shadows seemed to close in around me. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but deep down I knew better. There was something there, something watching me, waiting for me to slip back into sleep. And then, just when I thought the shadows couldn't get any closer, I saw it. Just for a split second, a figure standing in the doorway of my bedroom. Its shape was faint, barely more than a silhouette, but it was unmistakable. It was the same figure I had seen in the lake, with those hollow, lifeless eyes staring back at me. My breath caught in my throat, and I blinked, but when my eyes opened, the figure was gone. The room was empty again, but the fear lingered, wrapping itself around me like a suffocating fog. In the days that followed, the strange occurrences only intensified. One afternoon, while I was sitting at my desk, I heard the unmistakable sound of water dripping. At first, I thought it was coming from the kitchen faucet, but when I went to check, the sink was dry. The dripping continued, louder now, as if it were coming from inside the walls. I followed the sound, my heart racing, until I found myself standing in front of the bathroom door. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and as I reached for the doorknob, I hesitated. Something told me that whatever was behind that door wasn't going to be as simple as a leaking pipe. Slowly, I opened the door, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The entire floor was covered in water, just like the lake in my dream. But that wasn't the worst part. Floating in the middle of the room, as if submerged in invisible water, was the same journal I had found in the dream, waterlogged, its pages smeared with ink. My hands trembled as I reached for it, but before I could touch it, the dripping sound stopped and the journal vanished. The water on the floor disappeared as if it had never been there. I stood frozen, staring at the empty space where the journal had been, my mind racing with questions I didn't have answers to. As night fell, the feeling of dread only grew. Every shadow, every sound, every flicker of movement in the dark felt like a warning, a reminder that something was coming, and I wasn't ready for it. I couldn't shake the sensation that the lake, or whatever haunted it, was bleeding into my reality. It was no longer confined to the dream. It was here in my world, and it was watching me, waiting for the right moment to drag me back into its depths. But I couldn't understand why. What did it want from me? And more importantly, what would happen if it succeeded in pulling me under? That night, I made a decision. I had to go back to the lake. In my dream, it had called to me, and now, it was invading my life in ways I couldn't ignore. Whatever was waiting for me there, I had to face it. But as I packed a bag, ready to confront whatever nightmare awaited me, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was exactly what it wanted. The lake had been patient, pulling me in slowly, methodically, and now, it was time for the final act. The night I returned to the lake, everything felt wrong. It was as if the world itself had shifted into some darker, twisted version of reality. The sky was unnaturally overcast, with thick clouds swallowing the moon and stars, leaving only a faint glow behind. As I drove through the dense forest that led to the lake, the trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, casting long, eerie shadows across the road. The sound of my tires on the gravel was the only thing breaking the silence, but even that sound felt hollow, swallowed up by the oppressive darkness. When I finally arrived, the lake was waiting, just as it had been in my dream. The water was still, too still, its surface like a sheet of black glass, reflecting nothing but the faint outlines of the trees around it. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic, like the faint scent of blood carried on the wind. A shiver ran down my spine as I stepped out of the car, the cold night air wrapping around me like a vice. I knew deep down that whatever awaited me here was not of this world. I approached the shoreline, every step feeling heavier than the last. The soft, wet ground beneath my feet seemed to sink with each step, like the earth itself was trying to pull me under. My heart raced, the pulse in my ears growing louder as I neared the water's edge. In the distance, I saw it, a small, half-submerged boat, the same one from my dream, rocking gently as if it had been expecting me. That rhythmic heartbeat sound began again, this time louder, more insistent, coming from deep within the lake. I didn't want to get closer, but something, some dark force, compelled me forward. As I reached the boat, I saw it again, the journal, floating in the water. It was tattered, soaked, just as it had been in my dream, and beside it, on the shore, was a small, rusted pendant with the same symbol, the circle with the line through it. My fingers trembled as I picked it up, the metal ice cold to the touch. The moment I held it in my hand, a sudden rush of images flashed through my mind. I saw faces, hollow, empty-eyed faces, staring up from beneath the water, their mouths moving, as if they were trying to scream, but no sound came out. My breath hitched, and I dropped the pendant, my heart pounding against my chest. Suddenly, the stillness of the lake shattered. The water began to churn, violent ripples spreading out from the center, and then I saw it. The figure, rising slowly from the depths. Its pale, lifeless face was just as I had seen before, but now, in the faint glow of the moonlight, I could see more. Its skin was mottled, waterlogged, and its eyes were nothing but black voids, bottomless pits that seemed to suck in all the light around them. The figure hovered above the water, its ragged breath echoing in the silence. My legs refused to move, paralyzed by the sight before me. The figure began to move closer, gliding silently over the surface of the lake, its gaze locked onto mine. My heart raced in my chest, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body refused to respond. I could feel the air grow colder, each breath like inhaling shards of ice. The shadows seemed to reach out toward me, pulling me in as the figure drew nearer, its black eyes boring into my soul. Then, without warning, it raised its hand, pointing directly at me. The ground beneath me trembled, and the pendant I had dropped moments before began to glow with a faint, eerie light. In that moment, something snapped. My body jerked into motion, and I turned to run, but the earth beneath me was shifting, pulling me back toward the water. My feet sank into the mud, and I stumbled, falling to my knees at the edge of the lake. The heartbeat sound grew deafening, pounding in my ears, in time with the figure's slow, deliberate approach. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. All I could do was watch as the figure loomed over me, its face inches from mine. The figure's hand shot out, gripping my wrist with a force that sent a jolt of cold through my entire body. Its touch was like ice, freezing me in place. I stared into those hollow, black eyes, and in them, I saw flashes of something, moments from my past, memories I had long forgotten. I saw the pendant, clutched in my father's hand when I was a child, the same symbol etched into the pages of a book he had once owned. A deep, primal fear surged through me as I realized this wasn't just a dream. The lake had been connected to me for far longer than I had known. In a final moment of desperation, I yanked my arm free, and in doing so, broke the figure's hold. The shadows around me seemed to retreat, and the figure let out a long, low, guttural sound, like the groaning of ancient wood under pressure. Without thinking, I turned and ran as fast as my legs would carry me, away from the lake, away from the nightmare that had been haunting me. But even as I fled, I knew this wasn't over. I could still feel the figure's presence, lingering just at the edge of my consciousness, waiting. The nightmare wasn't confined to the lake anymore. It had followed me into the real world. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, breathless and shaking. As I fumbled for the keys, I glanced back at the lake one last time, half expecting to see the figure standing there, watching me from the shore. But the lake was calm again, the water smooth and still, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. The pendant still burned cold in my pocket, a reminder that the lake wasn't done with me. And deep down, I knew that whatever had started here, whatever dark force had awoken from the depths, wasn't going to let me go that easily. After the encounter at the lake, sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt as though I was being pulled back to that cursed place, the figure's empty eyes staring into my soul, waiting for me. My days were no better. The feeling of being watched lingered around me, pressing on my chest like an invisible weight. I couldn't shake the sensation that something dark was crawling into my life, infecting every corner of my reality. But what disturbed me the most was the pendant, the cold, rusted piece of metal now resting on my nightstand. It felt like an anchor, tying me to something ancient and malevolent. Driven by a desperate need for answers, I began researching the symbol etched on the pendant, the circle with the line slashed through it. I scoured books on ancient symbols, folk legends, and local myths, but nothing matched the eerie design. Days turned into nights as I obsessed over the mystery, until one afternoon, something caught my eye in an old, weathered book about local folklore. There was a small passage about a place not far from where I had visited, Silent Lake. According to the legend, the lake had been cursed for centuries, its waters claimed by dark forces that lured unsuspecting souls into its depths. The stories were ancient. People had been disappearing near the lake for as long as anyone could remember. The lake was known for its unnatural calm, an eerie stillness that covered the surface like a shroud. There were whispers of a time when the lake had been the site of rituals, dark ceremonies carried out by a long-forgotten cult. The symbol, my symbol, was the mark of those who had been chosen by the lake. Chosen not for any noble purpose, but as offerings to whatever lived beneath its waters. The more I read, the more I felt a cold fear gripping my heart. The disappearances, the dreams, the pendant, it was all connected. As I dug deeper, I found something even more disturbing. The names of the missing people were familiar. Too familiar. I recognized one of them, an entry from decades ago, a man named Marcus Vaughn, my grandfather. I had never known him. He had disappeared before I was born, vanished without a trace. My family never spoke of him, and I had always assumed he had abandoned them. But now I saw the truth, and it was far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. He had been taken by the lake, swallowed by the same darkness that was now coming for me. I felt my breath catch as I realized the depth of the connection. This wasn't just a random nightmare. I had been marked, chosen by something beyond my understanding, just like my grandfather. The pendant had been his, a relic from his own encounters with the lake, passed down through the bloodline. My father must have hidden it, tried to keep the past buried, but somehow, the lake had found me. My dream had not been a mere dream. It was a calling, a pull from the lake that spanned generations. And now, it wanted me. In a state of growing panic, I reached out to the locals, hoping someone could shed light on the terrifying mystery. I met with an elderly woman who had lived near Silent Lake her entire life. She was reluctant to speak at first, but when I showed her the pendant, her eyes widened with fear. She took a step back, muttering something under her breath. "You should never have gone there," she whispered, her voice shaking. "The lake, it takes people. It always has. Those it doesn't take, it marks. And once it has you, it doesn't let go." She told me about the strange occurrences over the years, the disappearances, the odd sounds coming from the lake at night, the dreams people would have just before they vanished. Those who were marked by the lake would see things, hear things, and eventually, they would be drawn back to it, unable to resist. She didn't know what lived in the lake's depths, but she knew it was old, older than anyone could comprehend, and that it demanded sacrifices. As she spoke, my mind raced. Everything began to fall into place, the dreams, the figure, the pendant. I realized that my grandfather had been marked, just as I was now, and that whatever had taken him was coming for me next. The fear that had been gnawing at me for days now exploded into full-blown terror. I couldn't escape it. No matter how far I ran, the lake would find me, just as it had found him. My nights grew more terrifying. The dreams returned, stronger than before. Each time, I found myself standing at the edge of the lake, the dark waters rippling as something unseen stirred beneath. The figure was always there, waiting just beneath the surface, its eyes hollow, its hand reaching out for me. I would wake up gasping for breath, drenched in sweat, but the fear never left. Even in the daylight, I could feel the lake's pull, its call echoing in the back of my mind. I knew it was only a matter of time before I would have to return, before the lake would drag me back. The locals' warnings haunted me. They spoke of a return that all marked souls eventually made. There was no escaping the lake's pull. It would beckon until I obeyed. Every night, I'd lie awake, the pendant cold in my hand, trying to ignore the growing urge to go back. But I knew deep down that I couldn't resist it forever. The lake was patient. The darkness in its depths was eternal, and it would wait until I was too weak to fight. I was no longer safe, not in my home, not in my mind. The line between dream and reality had blurred. The figure from the lake haunted both my sleep and waking hours, and I knew that whatever it was, whatever had taken my grandfather, was coming for me next. The lake had marked me, and soon it would claim me, just as it had claimed so many before. The fear clawed at my chest, tightening with each passing day. By the time I decided to return to Silent Lake, it wasn't out of curiosity anymore. It was desperation. The line between my waking world and the nightmares had blurred beyond recognition. Every moment, whether day or night, was haunted by the lake's cold, suffocating presence. My apartment no longer felt like a refuge. It was a prison where shadows danced in the corners of my vision, and whispers crawled through the walls at night. Each time I blinked, I expected to see that figure with its hollow, black eyes standing at the foot of my bed, waiting to drag me back into the water. I couldn't escape it, no matter how hard I tried. But I wasn't just driven by fear. I needed answers. I had to know why the lake had chosen me, why my grandfather had vanished, why it had marked him, and now, why it was calling for me. Deep down, I knew there was only one place where I could find those answers: Silent Lake. The very thought of returning there filled me with dread, but the pull had become unbearable. I could no longer sleep, and when I did manage to drift off, I was immediately thrown back into that same dream, standing on the shore, watching as the water churned, as the figure rose from its depths, reaching for me. Each night, the dream grew darker, more vivid, until I could feel the cold grip of the water against my skin even after I woke up. I packed a bag with little thought of what I might need: some food, a flashlight, and the pendant, still as cold and foreboding as the day I had found it. There was something about the pendant that felt like a key, something that connected me to the lake in ways I couldn't yet understand. As I drove through the darkened roads toward the lake, a storm began to brew. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and flashes of lightning illuminated the sky, casting eerie shadows over the twisting trees. The storm felt like a prelude to something, an omen of the darkness waiting for me at the lake's edge. When I arrived, Silent Lake was exactly as I remembered it: still, black, and endlessly eerie. The storm clouds above mirrored the lake's darkness, their shadows merging with the water, making it impossible to tell where the sky ended and the lake began. The trees surrounding the shore swayed in the wind, their twisted branches creaking like bones. The air was heavy, thick with an unnatural silence that made every breath feel labored, as though I were already drowning in the lake's suffocating grip. As I stepped closer to the water, the familiar sense of being watched washed over me, stronger than ever. I couldn't shake the feeling that the lake had been waiting for me, biding its time, knowing I would eventually return. Each step felt heavier, my legs growing weak, but I pressed on, driven by the need to understand what had taken my grandfather and what was coming for me. I wasn't alone. Standing near the edge of the lake, silhouetted against the dark water, was an old man. His clothes were ragged, his face lined with age and worry, and his eyes told me everything. This man had seen the lake for what it truly was. He had felt its pull. I approached him cautiously, but he didn't seem surprised to see me, as though he had been expecting me all along. "They told me someone would come," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "Someone like you." The man introduced himself as Thomas, one of the last people who lived near Silent Lake. He had spent his life keeping its secrets, warning others away, but most didn't listen. He had seen things, he said, things that had taken pieces of him he could never get back. His own brother had vanished in the lake years ago, pulled under during one of those same storms that now rumbled overhead. He had tried to warn him, tried to stop him, but the lake's pull was too strong. "It doesn't just take you," he said, his voice trembling. "It makes you a part of it." He told me the lake wasn't just water. It was something alive, something ancient, feeding on the fear and despair of those it claimed. The figures I had seen, the one in my dreams and the others glimpsed beneath the surface, were not ghosts, but echoes of those who had been consumed by the lake. They were trapped there, caught between life and death, forever part of the lake's dark soul. Thomas had never been able to save his brother, but he had dedicated his life to understanding the lake, to finding a way to break its hold. As he spoke, I could feel the weight of the pendant in my pocket, heavier now, as if it were reacting to the lake's pull. Thomas noticed me gripping it, his eyes narrowing in recognition. "That pendant," he whispered, his voice suddenly grave. "It's marked you, just like it marked the others." He explained that the pendant wasn't just a symbol. It was a bond, a connection between the lake and those it chose. It drew the wearer back, time and time again, until they succumbed. It was part of the ritual, part of the curse. My grandfather had worn it, and now it had found its way to me. There was no escaping the lake, not once you had been marked. But Thomas believed there might still be a way out, a way to sever the connection before it was too late. As he explained the ritual, the wind picked up, howling through the trees and sending waves crashing against the shore. The storm was growing fiercer, the sky flashing with lightning, and the air around us crackled with an energy I couldn't explain. The lake was waking up. I could feel it. Something was coming, something dark and powerful, rising from the depths. Thomas stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening in fear as he looked out over the water. "It's here," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rising wind. "It's coming for you." My heart raced as I turned to face the lake. The surface, once eerily still, was now churning violently, as though something enormous was stirring beneath it. The familiar heartbeat sound echoed across the water, louder and faster than ever before, and then I saw it, the figure rising from the lake once more. Its eyes were fixed on me, those empty, hollow voids that had haunted my dreams. But this time, it wasn't alone. More figures emerged from the water, their faces twisted in eternal anguish, their hands reaching out, beckoning me to join them. My legs refused to move. Fear paralyzed me, freezing me in place as the figures drew closer. The storm raged around us, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart and the deafening roar of the lake, demanding my surrender. The air around me was electric, the storm's fury rising in tandem with the chaos erupting from the lake. The ground beneath my feet trembled, as if the very earth was trying to pull me into the depths. The figures, those wretched, hollow-eyed forms that had haunted my dreams, were now fully risen from the lake's surface, their bodies dripping with dark, oily water, their arms outstretched, reaching for me. Their faces were twisted in expressions of eternal suffering, and as they moved closer, I could hear the faint whispers of the damned, voices carried on the wind, begging for release. My mind screamed for me to run, to flee from the nightmare unfolding before me, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. It was as if the lake had already taken hold of me, its cold grip freezing me in place. Thomas, the old man who'd stood by my side, had backed away, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. "It's too late," he muttered, barely audible over the howling wind. "It's too late for you." I could feel the pendant in my pocket, growing colder with each passing second, as if it was absorbing the energy from the lake, connecting me to the dark force that stirred beneath the surface. Desperation surged through me, and I reached into my pocket, pulling out the cursed object. The metal was ice-cold against my skin, and as I held it up, the figures paused, their empty eyes locked onto the pendant. For a moment, everything went still. The storm, the lake, even the relentless pounding of my heart. It was as if time itself had frozen. Then, from the depths of the lake, something else began to rise. At first, it was just a shadow beneath the water, a dark mass that grew larger and larger until it broke the surface with a sound like the world itself cracking open. The water parted, and there, towering above the lake, was a figure unlike the others. This one was massive, its form indistinct but undeniably human-shaped, though twisted and warped in ways that defied logic. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a swirling mass of darkness, where the features of its previous victims seemed to merge and dissolve, screaming silently as they were consumed by the void. And from the center of that swirling darkness, two enormous black eyes stared down at me, their gaze piercing through me as if stripping away everything that made me human. I stumbled back, the ground slick with mud, as the towering figure moved toward me, the water parting in great waves around its legs. The pendant in my hand pulsed, glowing faintly with a sickly light, and I realized, with a sudden jolt of terror, that the pendant wasn't just a marker. It was a beacon. It had called this thing to me. My grandfather hadn't just been a victim. He had been part of a ritual, and now, that ritual was about to claim me too. My mind raced, desperately trying to make sense of the madness unfolding before me. The lake, the pendant, everything was connected to this monstrous entity. It fed on the souls of the marked, drawing them back to the lake, where they were absorbed into its endless hunger. The figures I had seen in the water, the ones reaching for me, they weren't just ghosts. They were the remains of those who had come before me, souls trapped for eternity in the lake's grasp, unable to escape the pull of the ancient force that dwelled there. The air grew colder, the storm raging with renewed fury as the figure reached out a massive hand, its long, skeletal fingers curling toward me. I could feel the weight of its presence, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. My thoughts spiraled into panic. There was no escaping this. The lake wanted me, and it wouldn't stop until it had claimed me, just as it had claimed my grandfather, just as it had claimed the countless others who had vanished before me. But then, something strange happened. As the figure drew closer, its dark eyes locked onto the pendant in my hand, and for a brief moment, I felt a flicker of something, an understanding. The pendant wasn't just a symbol of the lake's power. It was a key, a conduit through which the lake's victims could be freed. My grandfather had been marked, but he had left the pendant behind as a way to break the cycle. He had known what the lake was, and in his final act, he had hidden the pendant from the lake's grasp, passing it down through the generations in the hopes that someone would find it, someone who could end the curse. The realization hit me like a bolt of lightning. I wasn't just a victim. I had the power to stop this. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I held the pendant high, its sickly light growing brighter as the figure loomed over me. The air around me seemed to vibrate with energy, the wind howling as the storm reached its peak. The figures in the water shrieked, their voices rising in a deafening crescendo, but I didn't falter. I could feel the power of the lake pressing in on me, trying to crush me, but I pushed back, focusing all of my will on the pendant. The dark figure hesitated, its massive hand inches from my face, and for the first time, I saw something flicker in those empty eyes, fear. It recoiled, its form shifting and writhing as though it were being torn apart from the inside. The water churned violently, waves crashing against the shore as the figures in the lake screamed, their twisted forms dissolving into the black depths. The storm above raged on, but I could feel the tide turning. With one final, desperate cry, I hurled the pendant into the lake. It hit the water with a blinding flash of light, and the air around me exploded with energy. The figure shrieked, its voice an otherworldly wail that shook the very earth. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The storm subsided, the lake grew calm, and the figures that had once haunted its surface vanished into the depths, their voices silenced forever. For a long moment, I stood there, staring at the still water, my heart pounding in my chest. It was over. The lake had released its hold on me, on all of us. The curse had been broken, but as I turned to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The lake was still, yes, but it wasn't gone. Its dark, ancient presence lingered, waiting, watching. And as I walked away, I knew deep down that Silent Lake would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for someone else to fall into its depths. The days that followed the confrontation at Silent Lake felt surreal, like walking through a fog where reality was still bending at the edges. I woke up in a hospital bed, the sterile white walls a sharp contrast to the dark, stormy night I had just lived through. My body felt heavy, as though I had been underwater for days, my limbs sore and my head pounding. The doctors couldn't explain how I had ended up there, or why I was found unconscious by the lake's shore. No one had seen the storm that raged through my mind, and the records showed no signs of the fierce winds or the black waters that had nearly swallowed me whole. To everyone else, it was as if nothing had happened. But I knew the truth. silent lake had let me go, but it hadn't forgotten me. When I was discharged, I returned home, hoping that the nightmare had finally ended. But the weight of the pendant's absence was something I couldn't ignore. Even though I had cast it into the lake, severing the bond that had threatened to consume me, I couldn't shake the feeling that a part of it, of me, was still tied to those dark waters. I kept seeing the symbol, the circle with a line through it, everywhere. On passing graffiti, in the cracks on the pavement, even in the condensation on my bathroom mirror. Each time, it sent a chill down my spine, a reminder that the lake's influence wasn't as far behind me as I had hoped. And then came the whispers. They began softly. At first, at night, when the house was still and quiet, I could hear faint voices drifting through the walls, like wind blowing through the trees. I couldn't make out the words, but they were familiar, carrying the same weight as the haunting calls from the figures in the lake. Sometimes, when I closed my eyes, I would see flashes of their faces, distorted and pale, their hollow eyes still watching me from beneath the surface. I tried to convince myself it was just trauma, just my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down I knew better. The lake wasn't done with me yet. As the days wore on, strange things began happening. Objects in my home started moving again, this time more deliberately. My keys would end up in the bathroom sink, dripping with water, or I'd find my reflection in the mirror lagging, just a second too slow, as if something else was watching me from the other side. There was always a lingering dampness in the air, a faint smell of stagnant water that never seemed to go away, no matter how many windows I opened. And then there were the symbols. They began appearing more frequently, scratched into the wood of my desk, etched into the glass of my car windshield, even painted onto the walls of the alley behind my building. Each time, the circle with a line through it, mocking me, reminding me of the bond one had thought I'd broken. One night, I woke up to the sound of water dripping, slow and deliberate, echoing through my apartment. I followed the sound, my heart racing, knowing what I would find. In the kitchen, there was a puddle of water on the floor, and at its center was the pendant. The very same pendant I had thrown into the lake. It was impossible. I had watched it sink beneath the dark waters, felt the energy shift as it disappeared. Yet here it was, lying on my floor, cold and gleaming under the moonlight filtering through the window. My hand trembled as I reached for it, and the moment my fingers touched the metal, a rush of cold shot up my arm, freezing me in place. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, surrounding me, enveloping me in a chorus of voices, angry, desperate, and accusing. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were demands. The faces from the lake flashed before my eyes, clearer than ever, their mouths moving, forming words that sent a wave of dread through my entire body. They were calling for me. The lake was calling for me. I had broken the surface, but I had never truly escaped. I dropped the pendant and stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The room spun around me, the air growing thick with the stench of the lake, of rot and decay. I knew then that the lake wasn't finished with me. The pendant was proof of that. It had returned to me, not as a relic of the past, but as a reminder of what was still waiting beneath the surface. The lake had let me go, for now, but it would never truly let me escape, not until it had claimed what it wanted. The next morning, I left the apartment, the pendant still lying on the floor where I had dropped it. I couldn't bring myself to touch it again, but I knew it didn't matter. No matter where I went, it would find its way back to me. It always did. As I stood by the window, staring out at the city below, I couldn't help but feel that same creeping dread crawling up my spine. The faces, the voices, the presence of the lake, it was all still with me, a shadow I couldn't outrun. I had survived the nightmare, but the nightmare hadn't let go of me. And as I looked into my own reflection in the glass, I saw something flicker behind my eyes. Something dark, something ancient, something that had been waiting in the depths of the lake for far too long. Was it all just a dream, or had the lake marked me in a way that could never be undone? The questions lingered, unanswered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. And as the days turned into weeks, I began to wonder if the true horror wasn't the lake itself, but what it had left behind in me. The symbol, the circle with the line, kept appearing as if mocking me, a silent reminder that my story with Silent Lake was far from over. I leave you with this. Was I just another victim of the lake's curse, or is there something more to the darkness that now follows me? What is it about the lake that pulls people in, and why does it never let go? If you're drawn to mysteries like this one, hit the subscribe button and share your theories in the comments. What do you think the pendant means? Why does the lake choose its victims? And more importantly, do you believe the lake will ever stop calling for me? Because sometimes nightmares don't end when we wake up. Sometimes they're just beginning. Make sure to like this video if you enjoyed the story and leave your thoughts below. Let's unravel the mystery of Silent Lake together. And remember, be careful where you sleep, because the next time you dream, you might find yourself standing at the edge of a lake far darker than you ever imagined.